Well, hello there. So in this video, we're going to actually try to answer a kind of technical question. If government increases its spending by, we'll say, 200 billion, why might aggregate demand increase by 300 billion, right? Because sometimes what we'll find is that when the government spends some money, or when businesses spend money, because actually this applies here too, if increase investment spending by 200 billion, aggregate demand actually goes up by more than that. And it's actually not just sometimes; all the time. It's pretty much a fact in economics that this is happening, and this is why, right? So today's lecture somewhat technical, but it's a really neat topic, and I hope you like it as much as I do. So we're going to start with the very basic ideas here. So let's kind of start slow and then build this thing out about why would that be happening. So this is the first kind of time we'll talk about income a little bit in some detail here. A little review, we talked about it before, but this is a review. Households get their income from selling factors. And what were those? Labor, primarily labor, right? But they own land and they own capital, right? Because ultimately the only people who really actually own anything are individuals and households. We would say firms don't own these things. They can maybe own them in a legal sense, right? You might have a corporation that owns land, but who owns the corporation, right? Well, it's households. So ultimately, households own these things. They get income by selling them or renting them. Now, their total income, you subtract taxes and you add in any money that they get free from the government, transfers, and they get that's what we call disposable income, right? So they can dispose of it as they see fit. And then from disposable income, they have two choices, right? You can only do one of two things. You can consume or you can save. Now, sometimes students are like, well, what if I put the money in my wallet? What does that do? And I go, that's called saving, right? So don't, what if I put the money into stocks? That's called saving, right? So if you're not buying something like an actual, object or service of some kind, you're saving your money. So it's kind of like you either consume or you save. Now, when we talk about this choice of consumption and savings, there's an interesting thing that happens. If your disposable income goes up, right? If your disposable income goes up, you're going to consume some portion and you're going to save some portion of that change in your income, right? So there's essentially, if I gave you an extra $1,000, you're going to save some part and you're going to consume some part of that extra 1,000. And what we define here are two terms: marginal propensity to consume and marginal propensity to save. They are abbreviated MPS and MPC. The marginal means the additional, right? So remember this word from last semester, it just means additional. And it's keying us in that this is not just saying like what's your total, right? It's the change. So it's a derivative in another sense. This is also propensity. Propensity means what you're likely to do. And so if we had the additional $1,000, what is the likely amount of that you consume, right? That's the portion that you consume of the 1,000. So we define it as the change in consumption, that's change in C, divided by your change in disposable income. And so if I give you an extra 1,000, and so that's your kind of denominator, right? That's the change in your disposable income. And then I said you spent 800 of it, right? That's your change in consumption. So then that means it's equal to 0.8, right? Now, the second idea here is exactly the same. It's just what's the proportion that you saved. So if I gave you a 1,000, right, an extra 1,000 in disposable income, what's your savings? Well, necessarily, right, 800 and the other portion was 200 because you have to, right, consume or save. So you will sometimes see questions that ask you this kind of phenomena. And then, by the way, if you know one, you can instantaneously know the other, right? And the mathletes here, you can tell. You add these two numbers together, they have to equal 1. Well, why? Why would these two things have to equal 1, right? So plus, therefore, they equal 1. Boy, that's a weird statement right there, isn't it? And that's because you can only do two things. You can either consume or save. So we know that like any amount of change in disposable income has to flow to either consumption or to savings. So if you add them together, then it has to be equal to 1. Now, I'm going to show you, right, and we kind of just answered that question that's right below me. I'm going to show you how we might calculate this. And in fact, we'll talk a little bit about why these numbers are different for different people. So the first thing I'll say is that as you start at the very low end of income, like if you start very low and you give an additional $1,000 to somebody, they're going to spend almost all of it. right? And that's not because the low-income people are profligate and don't like to save their money, right? I can just tell you that that's not what it is. It's because when you're at the very low end of income, you're trying to make ends meet. And so any amount of money will often go towards increasing your standard of living. Maybe, you'll get, maybe you'll upgrade your TV or something like that, right? So usually at low levels, people don't, they're not able even to save as much. But as their income rises, they save a larger and larger and larger proportion of their additional income. So another way to think about it would be is like, there's only so many things that you can purchase, right? So if you're high income and you get an extra $1 million, you'll be like, well, I already bought a Lambo, I already bought a Bentley, so I don't really need another one. I'll just stick this in my savings account. And we see that happen actually quite frequently. And so that has some policy implications if you kind of let your hamster wheel turn for a moment. Like if we give extra money to people, low income people are much more likely to spend it, but high income people are not. So that's actually another reason why maybe the government, when they hand out these pandemic checks, why they wouldn't want to hand them out to high income people, because it won't have the same effect on aggregate demand, right? Because if I hand you a check for $1,000 and you save all of it, it didn't change aggregate demand. But if you spent almost all of it, it changed aggregate demand. I digress. Now, let's go ahead and calculate these actually to show you where you could start with just the raw numbers, get the change, and then figure out the MPC and MPS. So for the first one, I've done it for you. So let's do the second one, right? Now your consumption and your disposable income and all of these are given for you, but we have to figure out what's the change. So the change from 13 to 14 is 1,000. So that's going to be our denominator, right? Numerator, denominator. The change in consumption is 800, and the change in savings is 200. And I've actually kind of done this math up here already for us, but we could say the MPC would be 800 over 1,000, and so that's 0.8. The MPS is 200 over 1,000, so that's 0.2. Now the next one, a change is 1,000. And here the change is 700, and the change here is 300. Now it's critical that you do this change thing. Students over the years have always been like, well, I'm just going to divide the 500 by the 15,000 and call it good. Wrong. Don't do that, right? You get it wrong. I don't want you to do that. So 700 over 1,000, because we're using the derivative, right? We're using the change, not the actual just kind of raw number. And then here another 1,000, and the change is 600, and the change is 400. So this one's 0.6, this one's 0.4. This is a change of 1,000, change of 500, change of 500. So 0.5 and 0.5. And we already actually answered this question, why they must always equal 1. But you can see here that they do, right, always equal 1. And it's because you can only save or consume, right? You can't a change in disposable income. Like you can't do anything else. You can only save or consume a change in disposable income. So therefore the marginal propensities have to sum to 1. Now, this is where we're actually going to answer the question that I posed at the outset. If investment or if government spending goes up, why might aggregate demand actually go up by even more? So here's where we kind of take this number. If we have just a change in spending, exogenous is a fancy way for saying just like a change in spending that isn't correlated to anything else, then the effect is multiplied in the economy. The thing that I told you at the beginning happens because of the effect of marginal propensity to consume. And here's why. If the first person gets a check, right, for $1,000, they're going to spend some part of that. And when they spend it, that's going to increase person B's income. Because you go down, you spend some money at the little corner store. Then person B has marginal propensity to consume as well, and they spend, right, some of their new income. And that's the little sleight of hand where it's really important to note. One person's spending is another person's income. And so that next person is going to spend a proportion of it. Then their spending goes and flows to person C, right? And then that person, their income goes up, person C, and their spending goes to person D. And it kind of filters out into the economy. It's a ripple effect in the economy. And we can actually figure out how much of that ripple there's going to be by putting 1 over the MPS. So 1 over this value. So if we knew that for the whole economy, maybe we'd say the MPS was 0.1, then we could actually say that if we had any initial increase in investment spending or government spending, 1 over 0.1 is 10, it's multiplied by 10. That's the total change in aggregate demand. So the spending multiplier is 1 over the MPS. And we multiply that by the initial change in government spending or investment spending. And this works both ways. If you cut government spending, it multiplies larger, right? So we could say, a decrease of 50 billion in government spending times 10 is equal to a negative change here in aggregate demand of 500. So you can see how this can go both ways, right? You get this big magnified effect, and it's true for government spending and investment spending. Now, taxes are a little different. Taxes are, I don't think they're that hard, but some students get really hung up on it. If there's a change in taxes that affects your disposable income, then the effect is multiplied as well. And the multiplier effect is the idea that if I raise your taxes, it reduces your consumption in some fashion. And so it reduces spending and it reduces other people's income, which reduces other people's spending and so forth. So it contracts the economy more than we might think. If you raise taxes by 50, you might end up with actually a much larger reduction. It's quite simple to actually do the math on it. You do the change times 1 minus 1 over the MPS. Now, this is kind of a hard thing to remember. This is the tax multiplier, right? That's the tax multiplier. So actually what I sometimes tell students is just like, it's 1 less. If you know that, that the spending multiplier is 10, then you actually know that the tax multiplier is -9. And it's 1 less plus a negative sign. And that's because it works in the opposite direction. If you raise taxes, it's going to reduce consumption. And so positive taxes would reduce consumption. Thank you. Have a wonderful day.